Welcome to Millennium Counseling Center's podcast, where each week we go in depth into all things mental health, addiction recovery, and being our healthiest and happiest self. Enjoy. Derek, so 2024, it seems like we are way more open about talking about and realizing the effects of mental health on us. Are you seeing that with your clients? More people that maybe wouldn't 10 years ago be coming into counseling or talking about certain things? How are you hearing from clients about where we're at in today's age around mental health and how we're accepting that?
Yeah, I think you see it in two ways. I think that one, we were starting to head in that direction anyway. Then I think with going through a big event like COVID, that kind of accelerated some of those things that people were experiencing. And therefore, people who wouldn't necessarily have been open to those conversations or to getting help, but kind of became a little bit more necessary. And then another big key one I see is with younger people, kind of the younger generation of people in society are much more educated and aware of mental health and the positives and negatives that come with that and understanding that and openness about talking about that. And I think the reason why that's significant is because the younger people have been, they're kind of a timestamp of when they started to learn about these things. And so you see them being much more open and having a much smaller stigma around it. And for them, there isn't even really much of one. And so I think that those two things have led to people just being more open about it, more open to kind of all aspects of mental health, and whether it's therapy or whether it's self-care or any of those things that doesn't seem to come with the same kind of level of secrecy as it may have in the past.
Yeah. I mean, you walk down any street and you look at somebody, and everyone that looks able-bodied walking around seems like they would be quote unquote okay. But now I think we're realizing that like we can seem okay on the outside, but there can be things, and most likely are things going on the inside. And it doesn't have to be acuity like schizophrenia or other kind of like more kind of severe mental health conditions. It can just be anxiety or depression or stress or pressure of finances, relationships, job security, challenges in relationships, what's going on that's being covered in media, social media around elections or kind of conflict around the world. Like these are things that are just kind of being absorbed by everybody, and that's having an impact on us.
Absolutely. And I think that as human beings, many people want to be, in quotes, normal, or as you said, okay. And as more and more people have been talking about this and being open to talking about it, then that becomes the normal, right? We know when working with athletes that a number of famous athletes have come out and talked about their mental health and what they needed to do with that. And then it's also more open in families and just amongst people that they're speaking with. And to your point, it's very, very few people, maybe none, who aren't affected at all by mental health and even some levels of, as you said, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, any of those things. And so as that becomes normalized, I think people really recognize that there are some great tools out there and some things you can do to have that not have a major effect on your life negatively, or at least as not as much as it doesn't have to affect you as much as it may have in the past.
Yeah. So when somebody comes in and is talking with you about a buildup of angst, anxiety, pressure, stress, how are you helping them identify that?
There's a few levels to that. I think one is it situational, right? Is there some particular thing that is helping create that? I think naturally as people, that's what we do. If we're feeling, our body is telling us something, we're starting to feel more stress, more strain, more scattered, any of those things. I think it's first is that's happening within us. And are we noticing that? Am I aware of that? The first step usually for people internally is to say, okay, well, what is it? What am I worried about? What is bothering me? And sometimes we can identify those things and sometimes we can't. And, I think the things that we do is help people learn how to be aware of it at some level, identify where that's coming from, but that's almost not even the most important part because it's what's happening internally, which is what we really need to deal with. Changing those outside situations doesn't usually necessarily solve the problem for you. And then talking about what are the things you can do to make that feel a little better or not be building up so much. How do you release that pressure?
Yeah. Well, and I know for me, like over time, I've become more aware of those things. And on any given week, I have a certain number of things that I'm responsible for that come somewhat easily for me. And when those things don't seem so easy, like that's my first cue, whether it's being able to help with chores around the house or wake up on time or have a positive outlook. Like when those things are harder for me, like I know that that means that something is happening within me and I need to begin to apply more self-care, more kind of attention towards that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. And I think we all have these kind of internal systems that make us aware of that, right? Like you just mentioned kind of what happens for you internally. What happens for me is kind of the severity of my reaction to something. And, I'm kind of constantly looking at is how I'm feeling proportional to what I'm reacting to and the amount of time and energy I'm spending on something and whether that is proportionate to actually how much that could affect my life or our lives. And so if that is kind of out of whack, if I'm spending more time, energy, focus, thought processes on something then really it probably deserves from how big of an impact it will make, then I realize that that is built up and that's when I need to kind of step in and be really, I love the word intentional for lots of reasons, but in this case, you recognize something and then we kind of make an intentional effort to fix that or to help that. And then, the last part is what do we do? How do we do that? Right? How do I solve that once I've identified it and also acknowledged it?
Yeah. And one of the ways I think about it is if I have a lot of tabs open on my laptop and they're all running pretty smoothly and I could kind of operate like that, if things are starting to glitch, I have to close some tabs. And if I don't close some of those tabs and really focus on some prioritization of the things that are right in front of me, then the whole system could shut down. And so for me, it really becomes about kind of navigating what are the things that aren't kind of essential in a given moment or a day and really kind of focus on just a handful of things and for me that I just call that self-care. So it's like I can't do everything that I'm used to doing and there's I think a level of acceptance in that. And in the beginning there was some kind of humble pie around that. Like, oh, wait a minute, like I can't do all of this all the time. And what has that's kind of evolved to for me is like, that's okay. It's okay if I can't do everything all the time. And to really recognize that and that's for me has been really helpful.
Yeah, and to kind of piggyback on your analogy or metaphor around the kind of open tabs, one of the things that people often talk to me about and I personally really identify with is just that there's so many tabs, right? There's so many tabs that are open and when I'm in a good place and being efficient and productive, then I'm able to kind of go to a tab, focus on it and then move on to the next one. When I'm not, I'm basically just like flipping through tab after tab after tab after tab and I'm aware of it. I'm acknowledging that the tab is open but I'm not really doing what I need to do with it to close it. And I'm also not really spending the time that I may need to have that feel like I've actually accomplished something, which I think then therefore just builds up to more of that kind of anxiety and stress. So learning how to, I think to your point, self-care for me oftentimes means slowing down and, kind of taking things a little more methodical, even though I'm more comfortable kind of in chaos and hectic activity in my brain, if I am feeling that, then I need to slow that down and I need to kind of just be a little more kind of intentional about going to each one of those tabs.
Yeah. And I guess one of the things that I've seen in my work with people is, one of the ways to begin to identify when there's an increase in amount of pressure or stress or anxiety is more things related to checking out or numbing out, more social media, more TV, more eating, drinking. So the way to begin to identify that something is going on may not necessarily be I'm tired, right? Or like you said, your reaction to a situation, maybe, to a greater degree. There's other ways that people can begin to notice that there's a buildup of stress or pressure. And that's one of the things that I'm hearing from people and kind of talking through how to identify those, not necessarily as your normal pattern, but something more is going on. And those could be the solution for what's going on.
Yeah, and to your point, the kind of interesting part of it as we do what we do all day every day is you see that sometimes those things that people are using to check out or numb out or in theory to get away from the stress and anxiety, many times those end up really becoming not just a hindrance, but they become the issue, right? They become the thing that's causing most of that. If you look at kind of how people use substances and if there's, kind of continued use of that, then ultimately that becomes the centerpiece of the stress or strain for them. It starts out as a belief that it's something that's going to help with that and is going to help us, like you said, check out or relax or numb or however you want to say it. But as that builds up, and you see the same thing with some things that sound a little more innocent like social media or like watching the news coverage or any of those things that they are increasingly kind of filled with more energy and more kind of controversy and some divisiveness and those types of things. And so we believe that we're solving something by getting out of our head and into one of these other areas, substances, social media, news media, whatever that is. And then that now actually works in the opposite for us and it creates more of that, which is really confusing because there may be at other times of our lives when that may have worked. There was a time, and I think that's one of the things for people who ultimately struggle with substance abuse is for most people, whatever substance they're using at one point had some benefit, but over continued use and increased use, then that benefit has decreased. And so, but in our brains, we still somehow believe that that benefit is there, even though it hasn't been there in a long time.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what we're kind of talking about is how kind of without knowing, our body is finding solutions for our problems and coming in to see a counselor, seeking out mental health treatment is really about getting to know what our patterns are and kind of what are some of those initial challenges that maybe led to the coping mechanisms or led to us trying to find ways to actually solve our problems that became kind of a greater issue. And for me, that's really part of the destigmatization of counseling and mental health is we all are kind of going through or dealing with certain things. We may not all be at the degree of coping that other people may be at, but we're all kind of navigating different stressors in our life. And that's just part of navigating being a human being.
Yeah. Oftentimes I hear from people is they will say something like, yeah, I just don't feel very good, but they don't really know where that comes from or why that is, or even how to identify that feeling. It just doesn't feel good. And so I think that's, of all the things you can do around, self-care or mental health, whether it's therapy or whether it's meditation or whatever, kind of areas that you may use, I think that's ultimately what kind of happens is we, I don't feel good. I want to understand it. And, how do I do that? And so first you kind of do a better job of identifying what actually that feeling is and then try to locate where that's coming from or how that's showing up. And then also, okay, so what are we doing to try to mitigate that? And are the things we're doing actually working? Or are they just increasing that? Because that's the thing is if I have a headache and my answer is hit my head against the wall to get rid of the headache, then it's probably not going to turn out too well for me. So I need to identify that that's not what I should be doing at that time. And I have to find something that maybe I'll just use a pillow instead.
I like that. I also think too that one thing that I hear from people and I can relate to as well is that, and I think you mentioned this earlier, where when we begin to relate to things differently, we don't necessarily need to look at that. We need to look at what's driving it. And I think that's really helpful for people. It's like whether somebody really likes to be on time or somebody really likes to be a planner or other things, those may become more exaggerated because of stress. And so it's not that those things are inherently bad, like you had mentioned about news or social media, other things may not be inherently bad, but sometimes we have to look at the way we're relating to it. And if that's becoming to be a little bit off, how do we take care of ourselves so we can get back to that working for us and being okay?
Yeah. I mean, I think that all goes back to kind of self awareness. And I think learning how to be more self aware and how to identify these things is really important. And I don't think it's a natural, I don't think that happens naturally for everyone. Some people are inherently a little more self aware than others, but it's a skill set that I think, I look at self awareness and gratitude in the same boat. I think it doesn't matter how much self awareness or gratitude you have in your life, both of them, if we can continue to increase those and understand those two areas, it's always going to be a benefit.